Margaret Henderson was 68 years old the night she learned that everything she'd been taught about fear was wrong. She'd spent her entire life in Boston, 6 decades of knowing exactly which neighborhoods to avoid, which faces to trust, which streets were safe, and which were dangerous. But on November 17th, 1983, at 10:47 p.m., she found herself alone and stranded in the one place she'd been warned about since childhood, Roxbury, Boston's most feared neighborhood. With $12 in her wallet, no working phone, and no way home, she was about to discover that the most dangerous thing she carried wasn't in her purse. It was in her mind. This is the true story of one wrong bus, one terrifying night, and the strangers who became family. It's about the moment fear meets truth, and what happens when the people you've been taught to fear become the people who save your life. Rain drummed steadily against the plastic shelter of the MBTA bus stop on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. It was Thursday evening, November 17th, 1983, and the early winter chill had settled over the city like a cold, damp blanket that wouldn't let go. Margaret Henderson stood beneath the shelter's roof, wrapped in her blue wool coat, with a matching knit hat pulled low over her neatly curled gray hair. She checked her wristwatch for the third time. 9:15 p.m. She'd just finished her weekly Thursday visit with her niece Dorothy in Alston. A pleasant evening of tea, conversation about Dorothy's new teaching job, and looking at photos of Dorothy's recent trip to Cape Cod. Now Margaret was ready to head home to her small one-bedroom apartment on the quiet edge of Beacon Hill, where she'd lived alone for the past 3 years since her husband Harold had passed away from a heart attack. The first safety rule Margaret was about to violate: always double-check transportation details when you're tired, when visibility is poor, or when you're in a hurry. Mistakes made in haste can have consequences that last for hours, or in Margaret's case, change the course of a lifetime. Why, one shouldn't soy me. Margaret pulled her wire-rimmed glasses from her purse and tried to wipe them clean with a tissue. The lenses had fogged up from the temperature changes. Cold outside, warm in Dorothy's apartment, cold again at the bus stop, and the light mist of rain wasn't helping. She squinted up the street, and through the blur of rain and fogged lenses, she saw the glowing headlights of an approaching bus. She held her glasses up to the dim streetlight, trying desperately to read the number on the front of the approaching vehicle. Was it 47? The 47 would take her directly to Beacon Hill. Or was it 42? The 42 went somewhere else. She couldn't quite make it out. The bus was slowing down, and she had only seconds to decide. It's going in the right direction, she thought, her tired mind making the calculation quickly. I'm already running late. It'll be fine. And now, she climbed aboard quickly, dropping her coins, exact change, the way Harold had always taught her, into the fare box with cold, stiff fingers. "Excuse me," she said to the driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes who was already reaching for the lever to close the doors. "This goes toward Beacon Hill, doesn't it?" "Eventually," he muttered, without looking up from the schedule sheet in his lap. "Gets there one way or another." Margaret took that as confirmation. What she didn't realize, what she would realize far too late, was that eventually and one way or another were not the same as directly. The driver's vague answer should have been a red flag, a signal to ask more specific questions. But exhaustion and the pressure of the closing doors made her accept an answer that wasn't really an answer at all. She made her way down the narrow aisle, gripping the metal poles for balance as the bus lurched forward. The vehicle was nearly empty at this hour. Just her, 2 teenagers in acid-wash jeans, sitting near the front, listening to a boombox, playing something loud and incomprehensible, and an elderly man in a... Margaret settled into a window seat about halfway back and arranged her purse on her lap. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched the familiar streets of Boston slide past, the elegant brownstones of Back Bay, the lights of closed shops, the occasional pedestrian hurrying through the rain with an umbrella. The bus should have taken its usual route down Commonwealth Avenue, then cutting through the public garden toward Beacon Hill. The journey normally took about 20 minutes, and Margaret had made it dozens of times over the years. But tonight, something was different. And here's where Margaret made her second critical mistake. She allowed herself to close her eyes and rest, trusting that the familiar route would stay familiar, that nothing would change. In unfamiliar or late-night situations, seniors should always stay alert, count stops if necessary, and set a mental alarm for their destination. Margaret's exhaustion overrode her caution. The gentle rocking of the bus, combined with the rhythmic sound of rain and the warmth from the heater vents, lulled Margaret into a drowsy state. Her eyes grew heavy. She told herself she'd just rest them for a moment, just until they reached the public garden. Just a minute or two. When she opened her eyes again, everything had changed. The view through the window was completely unfamiliar. The elegant brownstones were gone, replaced by older buildings, brick structures with many windows boarded up or broken, graffiti-covered walls in bright, angry colors, empty lots filled with debris and abandoned cars, chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. Street signs showed names she'd never seen before. Humboldt Avenue, Townsend Street, Wambeck Street. Margaret's heart began to pound. She lurched to her feet, grabbed the yellow pull cord, and hurried to the front of the bus as it slowed to a stop. Whoa. The teenagers with the boombox had gotten off at some point while she'd been dozing. The elderly man still slept. She was alone with the driver. "Excuse me." Margaret's voice came out higher and tighter than she intended. "Where are we? What neighborhood is this?" The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror with an expression somewhere between boredom and irritation. "Roxbury. This is the end of my route. I'm heading to the depot." Roxbury. Gotcha. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her stomach dropped. Her hands went cold. Roxbury. Gotcha. Of all the neighborhoods in Boston, of all the places she could have ended up, it was Roxbury. The neighborhood she'd heard about in whispered warnings her entire life. Don't go to Roxbury. It's not safe there. Those people are dangerous. Crime happens there every day. The news reports she'd seen flashed through her mind. Drug busts, gang violence, shootings, robberies. Every cautionary tale she'd ever heard about Boston's worst neighborhood came flooding back. "I need to get to Beacon Hill," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "When does the next bus come?" The driver consulted his schedule, shaking his head slowly. "Last bus to Beacon Hill ran at 9:30. Next one's not till 6 a.m. tomorrow morning." Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. But it's only... She checked her watch. 10:47 p.m. There must be something. Another route? A transfer? "Lady, everything stops running by midnight, and most routes are done by 11. You want to get somewhere tonight, you'll need to call a cab." He gestured toward the door with obvious impatience. "I got to get to the depot. You getting off or not?" Here's where Margaret made her third critical mistake. She got off the bus without asking the driver to wait, without asking to be dropped somewhere safer, with better lighting and more people around, without getting the depot's address so she could walk there or call for help. When you're lost or in an unfamiliar area, staying with a known safe person, even a grumpy bus driver, is often better than venturing out alone. And me say, "And you are? And around. It's dark shy. I will know. Guess foul. Besides." Margaret stepped off the bus onto the wet pavement of Humboldt Avenue and Warren Street. The doors hissed shut behind her immediately, and the bus pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the rainy night, taking with it the last connection to familiarity and safety. She stood alone on the dark corner. The street was dimly lit by scattered street lamps, and Margaret noticed that at least 3 of them were broken, leaving pools of shadow between the islands of weak yellow light. Buildings loomed on either side, some showing lights in their windows, but many dark and abandoned-looking. Graffiti-covered walls and shutters. Trash collected in the gutters and against chain-link fences. About half a block away, she could see a group of young men. She counted 5 or 6, sitting on the steps of a brick building. Smoke rose from their cigarettes, and music played from a large radio balanced on someone's shoulder. Their laughter carried through the quiet night. Margaret clutched her purse tighter against her chest and looked in the other direction. Further down the street, a car passed slowly, bass thumping so loud she could feel it in her chest. 2 men stood on a corner talking in low voices, occasionally glancing in her direction. Fear wrapped around Margaret like a second coat, heavier and colder than the blue wool one she wore. She forced herself to think logically, pushing back the panic that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Okay. I need a phone. I need to call Robert. Her son Robert lived in Newton, about 30 minutes away. He could come get her. She just needed to reach him. She opened her purse with trembling hands and searched through it by the dim streetlight. Wallet, tissues, lipstick, matcha, reading glasses, keys. No change for a phone call. She'd used her last coins for the bus fare. She checked her wallet. Returns. Child wire. 3 5s and 2 1s. That was all the cash she had. She knew from experience that a taxi from Roxbury to Beacon Hill would cost at least $25 or $30, maybe more at this time of night. She was $12 short. At least. Here's a critical safety lesson that Margaret was learning the hard way. Always carry emergency cash, at least $50 to $100, separate from your regular wallet. Keep it in a hidden pocket, a shoe, or pinned inside your coat. You never know when you'll need it, and cash works when credit cards, phones, and friendly faces don't. Margaret spotted a phone booth across the street, illuminated by a flickering streetlight. The glass panels were cracked and covered in graffiti, but the structure appeared intact. She hurried toward it, her sensible, low-heeled shoes clicking loudly on the wet pavement, the sound seeming to announce her presence to anyone listening. She reached the booth and stepped inside, grateful for the small shelter from the rain. She picked up the black plastic receiver, pressed it to her ear, and nothing. Dead silence. She jiggled the hook. Nothing. She looked more closely at the phone and saw that someone had cut the cord. The metal cable hung limply, severed cleanly about 6 inches from the base of the phone. She tried the coin return slot anyway, some absurd hope making her think maybe someone had left change. Her fingers met only empty metal. The panic she'd been fighting surged up from her stomach into her throat. Her heart hammered so hard she felt dizzy. She was 68 years old, alone in Roxbury, at nearly 11 o'clock at night, with no way to call for help, no way to get home, and only $12 to her name. This is where the real story begins, where Margaret's lifetime of assumptions was about to collide with a reality she never expected. She stepped out of the useless phone booth and started walking, though she had no clear destination in mind. Maybe she could find an open store, a gas station, a restaurant, somewhere with a working phone, somewhere with lights and people. Her legs felt weak beneath her, her knees protesting with each step from the arthritis that had been getting worse over the past year. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound made her flinch. She passed boarded-up buildings with broken windows, gaping like empty eye sockets. Empty lots filled with debris and stripped cars. Brick walls covered in spray-painted words she didn't understand. After walking 2 long blocks down Humboldt Avenue, her coat now damp from the rain and her feet cold in her shoes, she saw them, 5 young men standing on a street corner beneath one of the few working streetlights. They were all black, all appearing to be in their late teens or early 20s. They wore hooded sweatshirts, hoodies, she'd heard them called, and baggy jeans hanging low on their hips. Several held beer bottles wrapped in brown paper bags. One of them had a boom box balanced on his shoulder, playing music with heavy bass that Margaret didn't recognize. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying in the quiet night air. This is the moment, this exact moment right here, where Margaret's lifetime of absorbed prejudices and fears crashed into reality. Everything she'd ever been taught, every news story she'd ever seen, every warning she'd ever received told her that these young men were dangerous. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run, to hide. But there was nowhere else to go, and she needed help. Margaret tried to cross to the other side of the street casually, as if she'd meant to all along, as if she were simply a woman taking an evening walk in her own neighborhood. But her sudden movement, combined with her obvious fear, caught their attention immediately. "Yo, hold up," one of them called out. His voice was loud, cutting through the night. "Hey, miss." Margaret's blood turned to ice in her veins. She walked faster, her arthritic knees protesting, her sensible shoes clicking desperately on the wet pavement. She clutched her purse so tightly against her chest that her knuckles turned white. "Miss, wait." The voice was closer now. She could hear footsteps behind her, multiple sets of footsteps, getting closer. She couldn't run. Her legs simply wouldn't carry her fast enough, and her heart was already pounding so hard, she was afraid it might give out entirely, just like Harold's had. She stopped, took a deep breath, and slowly turned around, preparing herself for the worst. Her mind raced with fragments of advice. Don't fight back. Just give them the money. Don't look them in the eye. It might provoke them. Stay calm. Don't scream. It won't help anyway. 4 young men had followed her, and now stood a few feet away. The tallest one stepped forward, and Margaret noticed a long scar running down his left cheek, starting just below his eye and ending near his jaw. His dark eyes fixed on her face. He held up both hands in a gesture that Margaret recognized after a confused moment as peaceable, palms out, showing he meant no harm. "Miss, you okay?" His voice was softer now, concerned rather than threatening. "You look lost." Margaret's mouth was completely dry, her prepared speech. "I don't have much money. Please don't hurt me. I'm just an old woman," died in her throat. All she could manage was a whispered, I just need to get home." The young man's expression shifted from curiosity to genuine concern. His eyebrows drew together, and he tilted his head slightly. "Where's home?" "Beacon Hill," Margaret said, and to her horror, her voice broke. "I took the wrong bus. I thought it was the 47, but I think it was the 42. I can't see well at night, especially in the rain, and my glasses were fogged." She was rambling now, words spilling out like water from a broken dam. "The last bus is gone. I don't have enough money for a taxi. I tried to call my son, but the phone booth doesn't work. I don't know what to do." I don't know where I am. I don't. The young men exchanged glances. The tall one with the scar spoke first. My name's Jamal. Jamal Washington. This here is Marcus Tyrone. And that's Deshawn. Each young man nodded as his name was called. Miss, I'm not gonna lie to you. This neighborhood ain't the safest place for you to be walking around alone at night. But you're safe with us. We're gonna help you get home, okay? I promise. Here's what Margaret couldn't have known in that moment. What she had no way of knowing. Jamal Washington was 20 years old. 2 years earlier, on a cold night much like this one, his mother Rose had been walking home from her night shift as a nurse's aide at Boston City Hospital. She'd been mugged 3 blocks from their apartment, hit in the head, and left on the sidewalk. By the time someone found her and called an ambulance, she'd been lying in the cold for over an hour. She died in the same hospital where she'd worked, never regaining consciousness. Jamal had made a promise at her funeral, his voice breaking as he spoke to her closed casket. He would never, ever let anyone else's mother or grandmother be in danger if he could help. Not if he was there. Not if he could do something. Oh, when is she? Margaret wanted desperately to believe Jamal, to trust the apparent sincerity in his voice. But 6 decades of programming don't disappear in seconds. Her hand still gripped her purse. Her body still tensed, ready to flee or fight despite knowing she could do neither effectively. Jamal seemed to understand exactly what she was feeling. He turned to his friends and spoke in a tone that carried clear authority despite his young age. Marcus, go get Mama Ruby. Tell her we got a situation here. Elderly lady, stranded, needs help. Tyrone, you and Curtis walk down to the bus stop on Warren and check if there's any more people stranded out here tonight in the rain. Deshawn, you stay with me and the lady. Let's get her somewhere warm and safe. The other young men immediately dispersed without question or complaint, moving quickly into the night. Margaret watched them go, confused. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Weren't they supposed to rob her? Hurt her? Demand her money? Isn't that what she'd been told her entire life would happen? Come on, miss, Jamal said gently, gesturing down the street. Let's get you out of this rain. You're shaking. Mama Ruby will know what to do. She always does. He started walking at a slow, measured pace. And after a moment of hesitation, what choice do I have? Margaret followed. Deshawn walked on her other side, maintaining a respectful distance of several feet. Neither young man touched her, neither crowded her space. They just walked slowly to match her arthritic pace. How long you been out here in the rain, miss? Jamal asked, his voice conversational, as if they were neighbors chatting on a Sunday afternoon, rather than strangers walking through a dangerous neighborhood at night. Maybe 45 minutes, Margaret said, realizing that her whole body was shaking now. From cold, from fear, from exhaustion, from the adrenaline draining away. I got off the bus at 11:15. Jamal shook his head, his jaw tightening. That's too long. It's 40 degrees out and raining. You could catch pneumonia, miss. That's serious. He stopped himself, but Margaret knew what he'd been about to say. Cut your age. I'm the operating. Young sees Jamal glanced at Deshawn, who immediately understood. Deshawn pulled off his hooded sweatshirt, his hoodie, and handed it to Jamal without being asked. Underneath, he wore only a thin white t-shirt. Jamal held the hoodie out to Margaret. Put this on over your coat, miss. You need it more than we do right now. Margaret stared at the garment in his outstretched hands. It was worn but clean, navy blue, with Roxbury High printed across the chest in faded letters. I couldn't take that. He'll be cold. Miss, you're already cold. You're shivering. Just take it. You can give it back later. Jamal's voice was firm but kind, the way she imagined he might speak to his own grandmother. Slowly, Margaret took the hoodie and pulled it on over her damp wool coat. It smelled like laundry detergent and something else. Teenage boy. Not unpleasant, just different from anything in her usual world. The extra layer helped immediately, blocking some of the wind and rain. They walked 2 more blocks, and Margaret began to notice things she'd missed entirely in her initial panic. Yes, many buildings were run down, neglected, damaged. But some had flower boxes in the windows, plants struggling but alive despite the late season. She could hear a baby crying somewhere in an apartment above them, which meant families lived here. Families with children, just like families everywhere. A cat, orange and skinny, darted across the street in front of them. An older woman in a housecoat swept her front steps despite the late hour and the rain, pausing to nod at Jamal. Evening, Jamal. Your mama would be proud, honey. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson, Jamal called back, his voice warm. This was a neighborhood, Margaret realized with something approaching shock. Not a war zone, not a crime scene, not a place devoid of normal life. It was poorer than hers. That was all. The people lived here, worked here, loved here, struggled here, hoped here, just like people everywhere. Venice. Here's the critical lesson that Margaret was beginning to learn, the lesson that would reshape the rest of her life. Poverty is not the same as danger. Run-down buildings don't mean bad people. A different culture, a different race, a different economic reality. None of these things automatically equal threat. The fear she'd carried her entire life was based on assumptions, not experience, on what she'd been told, not what she'd witnessed. And those assumptions, she was beginning to understand, had caused her to miss something precious, the possibility of connection with people different from herself. As they stopped in front of a modest brick building with a hand-painted sign hanging above the door. New Hope Community Church, Reverend Ruby Johnson. All welcome, no exceptions. Marcus emerged from the front door, followed by a heavy-set black woman in her 50s, wearing a floral dress that looked homemade and a thick cardigan despite the cold. Her hair was pulled back in a neat gray streak bun, and she wore glasses with thick lenses that magnified her eyes, making them look enormous and extraordinarily kind. She was already talking before she'd fully exited the building. Lord have mercy, she exclaimed, her voice rich and warm and somehow immediately comforting. Baby, you look frozen half to death. Marcus told me. Come inside right now, honey. Right now! Before Margaret knew what was happening, before she could protest or hesitate or worry, Reverend Ruby Johnson had wrapped one strong, warm arm around her shoulders and was guiding her up the concrete steps into the church. The interior was small, maybe 30 feet by 40 feet, but immaculately clean. Folding chairs lined the walls. A simple wooden altar stood at the front with a plain cross hanging above it. Handmade quilts decorated the walls. But what struck Margaret most intensely was the warmth, both the physical heat radiating from a space heater in the corner and something else, something less tangible, something that felt like safety, like home. Ruby sat Margaret down in a cushioned folding chair and immediately draped a thick knitted blanket around her shoulders, over the borrowed hoodie and her damp coat. Jamal, honey, put the kettle on. This lady needs hot tea. Marcus, get me that thermos of soup from the kitchen, the chicken one, with the rice. Both young men immediately complied, moving through the small space with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd done this before, many times. Ruby pulled up another folding chair and sat down directly across from Margaret, reaching out and taking Margaret's cold hands between her own warm, calloused ones. "Now, sweetheart, tell Mama Ruby what happened. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." And Margaret did. The whole story came tumbling out like confession. The wrong bus, the fogged glasses, the dead phone, the fear, the walking alone, the assumptions, the terror when Jamal had called out to her. Ruby listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her warm hands never leaving Margaret's cold ones, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. When Margaret finished, her voice hoarse from talking, Ruby sighed deeply. "Oh, honey, oh, my sweet baby, you've had a terrible, terrible night. But you're safe now. You're with family now. We're going to get you home. But first, we need to get you warm and get some food in you and let you rest." Margaret realized she couldn't remember. The tea at Dorothy's seemed like days ago. "This afternoon, I think, before I went to my niece's." That's exactly what I thought. Ruby accepted a steaming mug from Jamal. Margaret could smell chamomile and honey, and carefully transferred it to Margaret's trembling hands. "Drink this slowly. It'll warm you from the inside and calm your nerves. You're safe here, baby. You're home now." Here's a critical lesson that Ruby understood instinctively from years of community work and crisis intervention. In emergency situation, the first and most important priority should always be immediate physical needs, warmth, safety. Only after these basic needs are met can a person think clearly enough to make good decisions about next steps. This isn't just kindness, it's practical crisis management. Margaret's body needed care before her situation could be addressed effectively. As Margaret sipped the tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest and down to her still shaking hands, Ruby explained the situation with the calm practicality of someone who dealt with similar crises before. "Here's what we're facing, honey. We don't have a working telephone here at the church right now. The bill's been overdue 2 months, and the phone company cut our—" "But I need to call my son," Margaret protested weakly. "He'll be worried. And you will call him, baby. First thing in the morning when it's light and safe. Here's what we're going to do instead. You're going to stay here tonight. I have a small room in the back where I sleep most nights. I run a shelter program here." Margaret opened her mouth to protest. She couldn't possibly impose like this. Couldn't be a burden. Couldn't. But Ruby held up one hand, and something in the gesture stopped Margaret's words before they could emerge. "No arguments now. Hospitality isn't an imposition, sweetheart. It's a blessing. You'll stay. You'll be safe. And tomorrow we'll get you home to your boy. That's fine." Ruby's voice was gentle, but absolutely firm. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in matters of care and safety. Over the next hour, as Margaret sat wrapped in blankets, drinking tea and eating warm chicken soup with rice and fresh bread that Marcus had brought from his mother's kitchen down the street, her entire understanding of the world began to quietly, fundamentally shift. "Oine, afagse, asangsi, afed, kekekon." Ruby brought the soup in a chipped ceramic bowl, and Margaret noticed that her hands were shaking slightly as she raised the spoon to her lips. The soup was delicious. Real chicken, not from a can, with vegetables and herbs that tasted homemade. As she ate, people began arriving at the church. An elderly black man in worn, patched clothes, walking with the aid of a wooden cane. A young Hispanic woman who looked barely 20, carrying a sleeping toddler on her hip, while a small girl about 4 years old clung to her other hand. A thin white man in his 50s, with haunted eyes, carrying all his possessions in 2 large garbage bags. A teenage boy, black, who couldn't have been more than 16, with a fresh bruise on his face. Ruby greeted each person by name, hugged them, asked about their day, offered them food. "Marcus, honey, Get Raymond some soup. Juanita, baby, bring those children over here by the heater. Mr. Patterson, there's a cot set up for you already. Jamal made it up fresh. Tommy, let me see that eye. Who did this to you? Margaret watched in growing amazement. You do this every night? She asked Ruby quietly. Ruby smiled, tired but genuine. Every single night for 4 years now, since my husband passed and left me this building and no money, but a mission. We provide a safe place to sleep for anyone who needs it. Just 10 spots. That's all we have room for, but it's better than the... Why? Margaret asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Why do you do this? You don't have to. Ruby's eyes grew soft behind her thick glasses. Baby, we all have to. If not me, then who? These are my neighbors, my community, my family. We take care of our own here. Jamal, Marcus, Deshawn, and the others stayed to help set up for the night. They unfolded cots with practiced efficiency, distributed blankets and pillows from a storage closet, served food from a large pot on a hot plate. They joked gently with the children, spoke respectfully to the elderly man Raymond, treated everyone with the same dignity they'd shown Margaret. These weren't dangerous criminals. They weren't thugs or threats. They were just young men helping their community, doing the right thing, caring for people who needed care. Jamal, Margaret said quietly when he brought her a second cup of tea and a plate with sliced bread and butter. Why do you do this? You're young. You could be anywhere else on a Thursday night with friends at a party. Why are you here? Jamal sat down in the folding chair beside her, his long legs stretching out in front of him. For a moment he said nothing, and Margaret worried she'd offended him. Then he spoke softly. My mom used to volunteer here before she died. She and Mama Ruby were best friends, went to school together. After Mama passed, someone mugged her walking home from work, hit her, left her. I started coming around to help. It helps me, you know. He paused, swallowing hard. Plus, my mama always used to say something. You never know when you're entertaining angels. She meant you should treat every stranger like they might be somebody important, somebody sent by God to test you. You might just be a lost lady who took the wrong... Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, blurring her vision behind her wire-rimmed glasses. I'm so sorry about your mother, Jamal. Me too, miss, he said softly, his voice thick with grief that would never fully fade. But she taught me good before she left. She taught me that the world's only as good as we make it, and the only way it gets better is if we help people who need help. So that's what I do. That's what we all do here. At night, lying on a narrow cot in Ruby's small back room, staring at the ceiling while rain drummed on the roof and voices murmured softly in the main church area, Margaret couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, turning over everything that had happened, examining every assumption she'd ever made about the world. She'd been so certain, for 68 years, that she knew which people were safe and which were dangerous. She'd organized her entire life around avoiding places like Roxbury, avoiding people who looked like Jamal and Marcus and Deshawn. She'd made judgments based on skin color, on zip codes, on clothing, on accents. And yet, when she had needed help most desperately in her entire life, when she'd been cold and lost and terrified and utterly alone, it was those very people, the ones she'd been taught to fear, who had saved her. Hey, yes, you may, son. Do you darn me? I send our spades. Oh, he undear may be send and keep it. So I won't send it to my family. It's sad, sir, that people in her own neighborhood, her own community in Beacon Hill, she'd lived there for 15 years and couldn't name 5 neighbors. She'd never invited anyone over for coffee, never asked anyone how their day had been, never offered help when she saw someone struggling with grocery bags or looking lost, never attended a community meeting, never volunteered anywhere. She'd been so busy protecting herself from imagined dangers that she'd missed the real tragedy. She'd been living in isolation, surrounded by people but utterly alone, building walls to keep out threats that didn't exist while keeping out the one. But here, in this small church in the neighborhood she'd been taught to fear most, in a place with almost nothing in material terms, people who struggled every day to make ends meet were sharing everything they had. Food, warmth, safety, kindness, community. Margaret realized in the dark of that small room wasn't money or education or safety. The difference was love. The difference was seeing other people as human beings worthy of care, regardless of whether they looked like you or lived near you or could ever pay you back. Why, please. Morning came slowly. Weak November sunlight filtering through the church's small windows, turning the interior golden. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of children's laughter. Juanita's kids, playing quietly with some toys that someone had donated. She made her way to the main room, moving slowly as her joints protested the night spent on an unfamiliar cot. Ruby was already up, looking tired but cheerful, serving breakfast to the night's guests, scrambled eggs from somewhere, toast fruit from a donations box. She looked up when Margaret entered and smiled brilliantly. There's my girl. Morning, sweetheart. Come get some breakfast. Jamal's ready to walk you to that phone whenever you are. Me. After eating, Margaret was surprised to discover she was genuinely hungry. She prepared to leave. Jamal and Marcus accompanied her on the 6-block walk to the BP gas station on Blue Hill Avenue. In daylight, the neighborhood looked completely different. Yes, still poor, still struggling, still showing signs of neglect and economic hardship, but also alive. People walked to work carrying lunch boxes. A man washed his car in a driveway despite the cold. Kids in school uniforms waited at bus stops, their backpacks bright against the gray morning. An old woman swept her steps, just like people in every neighborhood everywhere. At the gas station, Margaret used a payphone to call her son Robert. She fed quarters into the slot. Jamal had lent her the change and dialed the number she knew by heart. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy and stressed. Mom, where the hell have you been? I've been calling your apartment all night. I was about to call the police. Where are you? I'm fine, Robert. I'm safe. I got lost last night. Took the wrong bus. But I'm okay. I'm in Roxbury, at the BP station on Blue Hill Avenue. Can you come get me? There was a long pause. When Robert spoke again, his voice was tight with a mixture of relief, anger, and something else. Roxbury, Mom, what were you doing in? Never mind. Don't move. I'm leaving right now. Stay where people can see you. Don't talk to anyone. Just stay safe. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Margaret hung up and turned to Jamal and Marcus, who had been standing a respectful distance away, giving her privacy. He's on his way. Thank you. Thank you both so much. I don't know how to repay you for. Jamal shook his head, cutting her off gently. You don't repay kindness, miss. You can't repay it. All you can do is pass it on to someone else when they need it. That's how it works. That's how the world gets better. 45 minutes later, traffic had been worse than Robert expected. A silver BMW pulled into the gas station parking lot. Robert jumped out before the car had fully stopped, rushing to his mother and pulling her into a tight, almost crushing hug. Bye. Mom, thank God, I was so worried. I thought. His voice broke, and Margaret realized her son was crying. I thought something terrible had happened to you. As he held her, Margaret noticed Robert's eyes scanning the area with obvious suspicion and discomfort, taking in Jamal and Marcus standing nearby, registering their presence, their race, their location, and making immediate, instinctive judgment. Robert, Margaret said firmly, pulling back from the embrace and turning to gesture at the young men. These young men saved my life last night. This is Jamal Washington and Marcus. I'm sorry, honey. I don't know your last name. Taylor, miss. Marcus Taylor. Dot. Jamal and Marcus, Margaret continued, her voice steady and clear, helped me when I was lost and scared and alone. They took me to Reverend Ruby Johnson at New Hope Community Church. Robert extended his hand, the gesture stiff and reluctant, shaking hands with both young men briefly, barely making eye contact. Thank you for helping my mother. No problem, sir, Jamal said politely, his voice formal in a way it hadn't been with Margaret. She's a good lady. We just did what anyone should do. Robert's hand was already on Margaret's elbow, gently but firmly guiding her toward his car, his body language screaming his desire to leave immediately. Margaret resisted, planting her feet. Wait. I need to go back to the church first. I need to thank Ruby properly. And I need to return Deshawn's jacket. I still have it. Robert looked alarmed. Mom, we should really just get you home. You've been through enough. You need rest. Robert, daughter. Margaret's voice carried an edge her son had never heard before, a firmness that stopped him mid-sentence. We're going to the church first. That's not negotiable. 10 minutes later, they pulled up in front of New Hope Community Church in Robert's BMU. The car looked absurdly out of place on this street, gleaming and expensive among older vehicles and cars, held together with prayer and duct tape. Ruby was outside sweeping the front steps despite the cold, humming to herself. When she saw Margaret emerging from the passenger seat, her face broke into a huge, genuine smile of joy. There's my girl. Your son found you. Praise God! Margaret walked up the steps, ignoring Robert's protective hand trying to guide her, needing to do this herself, and approached Ruby. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She pulled the older woman into a tight, genuine hug, the kind of hug she'd give to a sister or a dear friend, not a stranger she'd met 12 hours ago. Thank you, Ruby, Margaret whispered into the hug, her voice breaking. Thank you for everything. For caring, for helping, for showing me what I'd been missing my entire life, she thought, but couldn't say. Ruby hugged her back just as tightly, her strong arms wrapped around Margaret's smaller frame. You're welcome anytime, sweetheart. You hear me? Anytime. This is your church too now, if you want it to be. We're your family too. Margaret pulled back, reached into her purse, and removed her wallet. She took out the $12, every cent she had, and pressed the bills into Ruby's hands. Please, for the shelter, for the work you do. It's not much, but... Ruby tried to refuse, shaking her head, trying to push the money back. Oh, honey, no, you need this for... Please, Margaret insisted, closing Ruby's fingers around the bills. I need to give this to you. I need to do this. Please let me. Ruby's eyes filled with tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks. She nodded and accepted the money. God bless you, honey. God bless you. Robert, who had been watching this exchange from beside his car with visible discomfort and confusion, spoke up, his voice tight. Mom, we should really get going. You need rest. You've been through a lot. Margaret turned to face him, then looked back at Ruby. I'll be back. Next week? Is Thursday night good? The same night? Ruby's eyes widened in surprise. You, you want to come back? Here? I want to volunteer, Margaret said, her voice clear and certain. If you'll have me, I can help serve food, or sort donations, or something, anything you need. I want to help. Ruby's face crumpled, and she started crying in earnest now, tears streaming down her face. Oh, honey. Oh, my sweet baby. We would love to have you. We would be blessed to have you. On the drive back to Beacon Hill, Robert gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't contain himself any longer. His words burst out like they'd been building pressure behind a dam. Oh, Mom, I don't understand. Why would you want to go back there? That neighborhood is dangerous. The statistics don't lie. Crime rates, poverty rates, violence. Those people do not. I don't even chicken nominate a picture. Those people, Margaret interrupted sharply, her voice cutting through the car like a knife, showed me more genuine kindness in one night than I've experienced in 15 years living in Beacon Hill. Though Robert was quiet for a long moment, navigating through morning traffic. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but still troubled. But Mom, statistically speaking, statistics, Margaret said, her voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, don't account for individual human beings, making... She turned to look at her son, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time, seeing the prejudices she'd passed down to him, the fears she'd taught him, the walls she'd helped him build. The most dangerous thing last night wasn't being in Roxbury, Robert. The most dangerous thing was the fear and prejudice I carried in my own mind. That's what almost destroyed me. And that's what I'm not going to carry anymore. Margaret kept her promise. The following Thursday, exactly 1 week after that terrifying night, she returned to New Hope Community Church. She took 2 buses to get there. The right buses this time, double-checking the numbers before boarding. She brought bags of donated clothes from her apartment and her neighbors in Beacon Hill. She brought $50 in cash. She brought herself. And the Thursday after that, she returned again, and again, and every Thursday for the next 12 years. Margaret became a fixture in the Roxbury community, as familiar and expected as the church building itself. She helped Ruby expand the shelter program from 10 beds to 20. She tutored children who were falling behind in school, her years of education and patience making her a natural teacher. She wrote letters of recommendation for young people like Jamal, Marcus, and Deshawn when they applied for jobs in colleges. Letters that carried unexpected weight because they came from a Beacon Hill address with a white woman's name, and clearly are. In 1985, Jamal got his first permanent position at Boston First Bank, starting in the mailroom, but with a path to advancement. Margaret's letter of recommendation to the bank manager, whom she knew socially from her church in Beacon Hill, had made the difference. By 1995, Jamal was an assistant branch manager with 2 young children of his own. In 1987, Ruby's shelter program received a major grant from a Boston foundation. The grant came partly because Margaret had spent months networking with her wealthy friends and neighbors in Beacon Hill, hosting small gatherings in her apartment where Ruby could present the shelter's mission and impact. The money allowed them to add a small kitchen and bathroom, dramatically improving conditions. In 1990, Marcus opened his own auto repair shop in Roxbury after years of working for others. Margaret was his first official customer, bringing her old Buick in for an oil change and brake work. She told all her friends about the best mechanic in Boston, and Marcus's business grew steadily through word of mouth. By 1995, Deshawn had graduated from Roxbury Community College, the first person in his family to attend any college, and was working as a social worker, helping other young men in the neighborhood find paths forward. Margaret had tutored him in English composition and writing, meeting with him every Tuesday evening for 2 years, helping him believe he was smart enough and capable enough to succeed. And through it all, across all those years and all those Thursday nights, Margaret learned what community really meant. Not living near people, not even knowing their names or saying hello when you passed on the sidewalk, but being willing to help when help was needed, regardless of who needed it, or where they lived, or what they looked like, or whether they could ever pay you back. She learned that the walls she'd spent her life building, the careful boundaries between neighborhoods, between races, between economic classes, were artificial constructs that protected nothing while preventing everything that mattered. Connection, understanding, love. On Thanksgiving 1995, 12 years after that November night, when everything changed, Margaret organized a community Thanksgiving dinner at New Hope Community Church. She invited Robert and his wife, Sandra, and their 2 children. She invited her neighbors from Beacon Hill, hesitant at first, but curious. She invited Ruby and Jamal, and Marcus, and Deshawn, and dozens of others from Roxbury who had become her family over the years. The church was packed. Long tables made from wooden doors balanced on sawhorses filled the space. Every folding chair was occupied. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, black and white, rich and poor, young and old, all sharing food and stories and gratitude. Robert approached his mother midway through dinner, pulling her aside near the kitchen area where they could speak privately. His face was serious, emotional. "Mom, I need to tell you something. When you first started coming here 12 years ago, I thought you'd lost your mind. I was embarrassed. I didn't understand why you were throwing yourself into this place, these people. I thought you were being reckless, maybe even going senile." He paused, his voice thick with emotion, tears shining in his eyes. "But I was wrong. About everything. This," he gestured to the packed room, the diverse faces, the laughter and connection. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. You didn't just help people, Mom. You built a bridge." Margaret pulled her son into a hug, feeling tears on her own cheeks. "I didn't build anything, Robert. The bridge was always there. I just had to get lost first to find it. Sometimes we have to end up in the place we fear most to discover what we've been missing all along. Because sometimes, often, actually, the wrong turn leads us exactly where we need to be. Sometimes the people we fear most are the people we need most. Sometimes danger is just unfamiliarity, and safety is found in the most unexpected places. And sometimes it takes 68 years and one cold November night to learn that community isn't about comfort or convenience or surrounding yourself with people who look and think exactly like you. Community is about courage, about choosing to see beyond fear and prejudice to the humanity that connects every single person, regardless of circumstance. Margaret Henderson lived to be 86 years old. She never missed a Thursday at New Hope Community Church, except when she was hospitalized with pneumonia in 1998. And even then, she insisted Ruby bring her updates about everyone. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep on March 3rd, 2001, her funeral was held not in the grand church she'd attended most of her life in Beacon Hill, but in that small brick building in Roxbury where she'd found her true family. More than 300 people attended. The line of mourners stretched around the entire block and down the street. Black and white, rich and poor, young and old, bankers and mechanics, social workers and unemployed, all coming to say goodbye to a woman who had shown them that change was possible, that bridges could be built, that Jamal Washington, now 41 years old, with graying hair and 2 teenage children, gave the eulogy. His voice broke multiple times as he spoke, and he had to stop and collect himself. his wife reaching up from the front pew to squeeze his hand. "Mrs. Henderson used to tell us," he said, his voice thick with grief and love, that she got on the wrong bus that night in November 1983, that it was a mistake, an accident, bad luck. But I don't think it was the wrong bus at all. I think it was exactly the right bus, taking her exactly where God needed her to go. It just took her somewhere she didn't expect, somewhere she'd been taught to fear. And that's how God works sometimes, y'all. The detours are the destination. The wrong turns are right turns in disguise. The places we fear most are sometimes the places where we find what we've been missing our whole lives. Nature. He paused, wiping his eyes. My mama, my biological mama, Rose Washington. She died because nobody helped her when she needed help. But Mrs. Henderson, she helped everybody. She helped me. The church erupted in amens and yes, lords, and the sound of 300 people crying and celebrating and mourning all at once. And in that moment, Margaret Henderson's legacy was clear. Not wealth or fame or accomplishments, but simply this: a room full of people from different worlds who had become one family, connected by one woman's willingness to let go of, because that's what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Not the refusal to see danger, but the wisdom to recognize that the greatest danger is often the prejudice we carry in our own hearts. Margaret Henderson got on the wrong bus one November night in 1983, and she found her way home at last.